Abercrombie-Winstanley in Cleveland. She's a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council and a former U.S. ambassador to Malta. Gina, thank you so much for making the time. So many people focused on what happens next. Now, we know Hamas has agreed to release all Israeli hostages under Trump's plan. How would you rate this? Is this a major breakthrough and possibly an opening to the end of this long war?
Thank you so much for having me, Eli. I would say absolutely. This is a huge step forward as long as it comes through. Hamas did say that it might be difficult to make that 72-hour deadline, but they are committed to it and they will do their best to get them all out. This is a huge win for Israelis. Not as much for the prime minister because he wants so much more, but for Israelis who have been demonstrating, who have ensured that no one forgot that there were hostages being held, this is huge. The ceasefire for Palestinians is also huge. If the bombing does stop, and there are questions about whether it will be entirely stopped, but that happens when you've got two warring sides and a squishy withdrawal timeline. So we'll see how that works. But yes, this is a huge step forward. It's beyond where we've been for the last 2 years. Those hostages getting out are really what most Israelis were looking for.
I want to ask more about the hostages in a moment, but you mentioned the bombing, and in fact, President Trump called on Israel to stop bombing Gaza after Hamas signals its agreement to parts of the plan. And you mentioned Netanyahu. I mean, certainly there's celebration from the hostage families, seeing this as major progress, and yet we have heard reports, bombings continue, the deaths continue. Could the fact that we're still seeing activity inside Gaza City threaten this fragile peace plan?
Absolutely, it can. We have to remember that the ceasefire that President Trump insisted upon shortly after taking office was broken by Israel. Hamas did not break that ceasefire. Israel started the bombing again. So we have to keep an eye on the prime minister because he does have pressures from his government. Those to the right do not want this war to stop. They will be pressing him to take as much military advantage as he can. And it will be up to President Trump to put in place a hard stop to the bombing. We saw he can do it. He did it in January when he took office, and he did it again when Iran and Israel were at war, that he actually got Israeli planes to turn around in the air. So we know he can do it.
Could this continued action inside Gaza actually affect the hostages? They're certainly far from free right now.
That is correct. Until they are free, they are, of course, in danger. In danger from the IDF, quite frankly. We know that the vast majority of hostages were released through diplomatic negotiations. As a former diplomat, I've been pushing that from the very beginning. And we know that some hostages have lost their lives from IDF action. So we know that they are in danger until the bombing stops. Hamas has every reason to keep them, those that are alive until they're handed over. But it will depend on where the Israelis are being bombing and where the hostages are being held.
Now, Gina, as a diplomat, I'm curious what your view is of this proposal and kind of the difference of opinion. Trump is basically asking Hamas to disarm, to cease existence. And in their statement that they agreed, Hamas has talked about being part of whatever Palestinian state continues. So it seems like one of the most critical parts of the future of this region really is in conflict still.
Yes, that is going to be I won't say a sticking point. They may be able to finesse it, but it is going to depend a great deal on definitions. We know that the Israeli government basically tarred every Palestinian in the Gaza Strip as Hamas. They're always talking about Hamas-led ministry, the Hamas-led government. Well, Palestinians work for the government that, of course, was led by Hamas. But how far would Israel want de-Hamasification to go? Who's got to prove their bona fides as, a technocrat working for the government? whoever leads it, in the Gaza Strip. That's going to be one of the challenges. And of course, under international law, there is a right to resistance of occupation. There is a right. So Hamas, of course, de-arming is an absolute requirement. If they do that, if they pledge that there are lower level people who certainly espouse resistance to occupation, which is their right, there may be some way to finesse it, but we can be sure that the prime minister is going to be playing the very hardest of ball with Hamas.
Gina, with your experience watching what has been happening in the region, if you can just tell us briefly, I'm curious about the pressure the other Arab nations put on Hamas, because I saw that in their response, they mentioned kind of working alongside those other countries, and that seems to be playing an important role.
That's exactly right. We saw at the United Nations with the meeting that France and Saudi Arabia hosted that every Arab country called on Hamas to disarm. So they have lost the support for an armed conflict from their partners and neighbors in the region. That means they really do have to step forward in a non-violent manner. And they also recognize that this is a defeat for Hamas. It is a very thorough defeat, and they have got to depend on their Arab partners to do the negotiating with Israel and with the United States. The agreement that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu announced is not the same agreement that the Arabs signed on to a week before. There are things to be negotiated, including an explicit recognition of Palestinians having a right to a state, and then working toward that goal. All of these things are going to have to be negotiated via other Arab parties, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and other partners, particularly those in the Abraham Accords, because they've got serious leverage.
Right. Well, so many moving parts and pressure points to keep an eye on. Thank you so much for joining us, Gina.
My privilege. Thank you.
That is Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley. She's a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council and a former U.S. ambassador to Malta.